Hi, everybody. Today I've got I seldom have two guests in one shot. I've got Dr. Beth Shapiro, and I'll introduce her in a second, and Matt James. First, welcome. How are you guys doing?
Great. Thanks for having
Excellent.
us.
Okay, I wanted to introduce who you are. First of all, Beth, if I may address you guys by your first names, congratulations on a big award that you just received. I read it. Member of the National Academy of Sciences. So congratulations for that.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thank
I'm,
you.
I'm sure I must have some other guests because I've had a lot of incredible, illustrious guests, but I'm sure you're among a very few people on my show who hold that title. So you are a traditionally a professor at UC Santa Cruz. You've taken a leave to work at Colossal Biosciences, which that's what we're going to talk about today. Matt James, you are the Chief Animal Officer at Colossal. So maybe did I miss anything in terms of an intro that you guys would like to add?
No, it's
No,
perfect.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so I mean, I first heard of you guys. I don't know if I don't know if you guys know, but Joe Rogan and I are, pretty tight guys. And I saw Ben Lamb and I said, what the hell is this dire wolves and so on? And that's how I kind of got into it. So tell us what the company is about. Tell us what you're doing. So many exciting things to talk about. Take it away.
Matt, why don't you do that? You can do the overview.
sure. Colossal Biosciences is a biotechnology company that launched, in 2021 with the originally with this goal of restoring the woolly mammoth from extinction. But what Colossal has really become is this de-extinction and species preservation company that is building technologies today, whether that's from the genetic engineering and cell engineering, genome sequencing side, or reproductive sciences and assisted reproduction in order to bring species back from extinction and prevent future extinctions. So we're working on everything from woolly mammoths, thylacines, and dodos, and most recently, in the news, the direwolf, to how can we apply our technologies in meaningful ways to prevent the extinction of American red wolf, of the northern white rhino, the Mauritian pink pigeon, and tons of others. So it's been an amazing sort of 3.5, 4 year journey. And now, we've sort of made the big splash recently with the direwolf news that shows that the de-extinction pipeline is a full technology set that works today.
How much of the de-extinction, project involve new technology that just came about since the founding of Colossal versus it existed, but it just needed somebody to ignite the process? Walk us through that.
It's a good question. We're obviously standing on the shoulders of lots of work that's been done in lots of different fields simultaneously. We're reaching from ancient DNA extraction and analysis, computational biology, evolutionary biology inference, gene editing technology, all the way through, our assisted reproductive technologies and animal husbandry approaches. This is a pretty wide ranging. There are a couple of things that we used for the Direwolf project that were developed that were ours. The one that's gotten the most attention is this idea that we can clone cells that can be isolated directly from a simple blood draw. And we used that approach to clone the wolves that we cloned in this process. And this is really cool. It's a cell type. People have taken blood draws before and attempted to use cloning, this process that most famously brought us Dolly the sheep, with those different cell types. But they haven't used the cell type that we isolated, the endothelial progenitor cells. These are cells that will eventually become the lining of the blood vessels and things like that. We hypothesize that the reason that they are so robust is that they aren't as far down the pathway to we call terminal differentiation, the where a cell gets to where it only has the instructions to be whatever type of cell it ends up being, because there are different genes that are on or off or turned up or turned down if you're a skin cell or a liver cell or a heart cell. So they all have specific instructions about how to be that type of cell. The cells that we're cloning from don't really have all of those instructions yet. And so they're further back toward the type of cell that we want to start with if we're going to clone something, a type of cell that can become every type of cell that makes up an organism's body. And we found that these cells are not only really good for cloning, but they're also great for just growing up in culture, which is really useful for conservation. So we can grow up these huge, happy, healthy plates of cells, that we can then store and bank, that we can go back to later and turn them back on, bring them back to life, if you will, by thawing them in a careful way. And then they can divide and differentiate and be used for cloning 40 years from now, which would be really great for conservation. So
Well, this is not quite what you're talking about, but I'm a huge Belgian Shepherd guy. Way before it was cool to talk about the Belgian Malinois. This has been something that I've had my whole life. And when our first Belgian, we've had two. I always say that our children have grown up with these two majestic. I mean, literally, they look like wolves. Uh, Maybe even more vicious if you mess with our family. But in any case, when our first one passed away, I was so heartbroken that before he had passed away, we had extracted some, sperm from him, and which is still stored somewhere with the hope that eventually he'll be, you know, brought back to Earth, so to speak. Not quite in the way you guys are doing it. Where do you get the DNA material or any material that you're using for these projects? Are they historically, if you, I know you probably don't like the Jurassic Park analogy, but
love it.
oh, you
We're
love it.
happy to
Okay, good.
run with Jurassic Park. Go
Oh,
for
okay, good.
it.
It's the mosquito that's stuck in the amber that you pull out. Maybe that's probably not how you're getting it. Is there a particular source where all the stuff you're hoping to get for all of these different de-extinction projects?
I come from the field of ancient DNA. I've been working in that field for a really long time. This is the idea that we can pick up a sample from somewhere in the world, from an animal that used to be alive, and we can extract DNA. So we take a bit of that bone, powder, or hair, and we chemically dissolve all the stuff and release the DNA. And then we can use that DNA in a standard DNA sequencing. I say standard, it's a little bit different because the fragments that we can recover are really short and have damaged bits to them. But we understand how DNA decays over time. And so we can use computational approaches to piece those short fragments together to reconstruct the whole genomes. We can get DNA from skin, from teeth, from hair, from muscle tissue. We know that DNA survives longer when the bone or whatever material it is preserved in a cold place. So most of the work that's been done to date in the field of ancient DNA focuses on animals that lived in the Arctic. But we can also get high quality DNA from places that are consistently cool and dark. UV radiation will damage DNA. That's why we put on sunblock when we go outside. Freezing and thawing damages DNA because the water molecules expand and physically break the DNA. And then probably the thing that damages DNA the most is just microbial action. Fungus and bacteria chewing up the DNA to turn it into the next generation of organisms, right?
How do you know?
But
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, go ahead. What's the question?
I was going to say, so, in forensic science, in criminology at least, when you enter someone's DNA into the database, if that person is not already in the database for another crime that they've committed, I know their DNA profile, but I don't know who they are. So now you can see where I might be going with your question. If you pick up some ancient DNA that is ostensibly of some species, how can you know out of all the species that have become extinct that that DNA more so stems from species XYZ?
That's a really good question.
Mhm.
Part of it comes from extracting DNA from bones that we have identified. So I know that that's a mammoth bone, and the DNA that I get out of it creates an organism that, if you compare it to all of the sequences of animals that are alive today, is near elephants. And we know that that's a mammoth bone. So now I have a template for what I can say is mammoth-like DNA. So when I get tiny little fragments of bone that I don't know what it is, or we can even extract DNA directly from sediments. You can go and take a plug, like a long core, and suck out a bit of dirt and extract DNA and find all of the plants and animals that were alive in
How
that
you do for
spot at that time.
ice, you do that with, right? With
Yeah, you could do, and dirt as well. just sediments. I have colleagues who work in the Arctic who will just take plugs out of a wall, and we can radiocarbon date bits of plants so we know how old it is, and then extract DNA and amplify. We call them barcode regions, so parts of the genome where everybody's different than each other. All of the different species out there are different from each other, but in a way that we already know what it is. So we can say, oh, that's a mammoth, and that's a bison, and that's a horse. And then we can get some idea of the relative abundance of these different animals in that landscape and also what that community looked like. It's actually really cool. I was involved in a project a while ago where we went to St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea, which is the second last place mammoths ever lived. Mammoths survived on Wrangel Island off the northeastern coast of Siberia until just about 3,000 years ago. So there were people building pyramids at the same time as there were mammoths in the Arctic. But they also lasted until about 5,000, 6,000 years ago on St. Paul Island, which is in the Bering Sea. St. Paul was connected to Alaska, and then at the end of the Ice Age, as the sea level rose, it got disconnected, and a population of mammoths got trapped there. And we wanted to know when they went extinct and why they went extinct, but we didn't have that many bones. So we went to the only source of fresh water on the island, which is a volcanic caldera that is filled with water, where the people who live there now go swimming during the summer. And we went out during the winter when it was frozen over the top and shoved a long metal core into the bottom of that freshwater lake and then sucked out all of the dirt. And then because the oldest stuff is at the bottom and the youngest stuff is at the top, we could get an age profile of how old stuff was. And we could extract DNA from all of it and see what happened. Did the plant community change? Did something else change that might have made mammoths go extinct? We knew it wasn't people because people weren't present on St. Paul Island at the time. We actually found that what happened was probably there was a massive drought, and the water of that lake became really salty and had different types of organisms that could only live in salty water because the seawater will have introgressed. And that was the only source of fresh water on the island. And they probably just ran out of stuff to drink. And that's why
Wow.
mammoths died 5,600 years ago on St. Paul Island. But we
Wow.
learned that just by looking at DNA preserved in sediment, which is pretty fascinating, I
Am-
think.
Amazing. I mean, if there are young people watching this today's show, if this doesn't excite you about science, I don't know what would, right? How do you decide the order? So right now you've only de-extinctified, or I'm probably using the wrong verb, one species, the dire wolf. Then you mentioned the dodo bird, maybe others. As someone who my doctoral dissertation was actually in psychology of decision making, so I'm interested in all things related to how do people make decisions. So, what is the decision making process out of all possible species that you could de-extinctify? How do you choose which ones to go first, second, third, fourth?
You know what's so funny? I'm going to answer the question, but first I have to just acknowledge I have always said that I really hate the word de-extinction because I cannot figure out how to conjugate it, which is the problem that you're having right now.
Right.
I don't want to say you de-extincted. It just sounds terrible, but
True.
is de-extinctified any better? I don't know. Maybe not, whatever. I think, the decision-making process about picking the original ones is really about um, well, there's a bunch of different things. I mean, as you point out, there's going to be some social idea here. What do you want? People want dinosaurs. As soon as they figure out we can't have dinosaurs because no dinosaur DNA survives, the next thing people think about is mammoths. That's why my first book was called How to Clone a Mammoth. If I'd written a book about how to clone the Christmas Island kangaroo rat, nobody would have cared, right? So there's partly that. And then there's my side and Matt's side. So from my side, the challenges are, can we actually get DNA from this animal, right? Is there sufficient information preserved that we could understand what it is about the DNA code that makes that animal different from whatever animal we're using as the surrogate species, right? So, and then can we learn what those differences actually are and choose edits that we can make in a way that we know are going to be safe in a genetic background of a different species? Because we know we can't make all of the changes that were there. So how can we, is there a scientifically rigorous ethical, careful path that we can choose to make the decisions about what we're going to do. And then the other technologies, we've launched Dodo, but right now there isn't really a mechanism to transfer edited DNA sequences between generations of birds because you can't clone birds using the process that brought us Dolly the sheep. So there are teams internationally that have been working on different approaches, and our team is also working on a different approach to do this. But that's a blocking aspect of that de-extinction project that's on our end. And then I'll pass it over to Matt, but there's lots of problems after we have cells as well. So
Yeah, I mean, the reproductive science plays a huge role in this, right? To Beth's point, you can edit cell lines all the way to a point where suddenly you need to create an embryo, which is sort of our challenge on the avian side. But with every mammal species we work with, we also have a unique set of challenges, whether that's elephant anatomy required for mammoth restoration is really difficult, and their reproductive physiology is still quite a mystery to us, to resource availability. How many oocytes or eggs can you get for this cloning process, which is still not a very efficient process. So it takes a number of eggs to create a single embryo. So those are a lot of the challenges that we face along the way. And then the question is, if you bring it back, how do you take care of it? Can it be gestated within a living animal today, or do we need to create a synthetic solution for gestation, like an artificial womb? And if once it's born, how do you take care of it, and where does it go in the wild? And most importantly is the why. Why are we bringing it back? What purpose does it serve to science, conservation, to humanity? And so those are some of the discussions we have. So as you might imagine, you put 20 people around a table and we'll have 20 different opinions on what should be first and why it should be first.
Do you take a vote? Is it a majority vote? Is it a democracy? What is there an autocratic dear leader? How do you navigate through the 20 choices?
I would say we live somewhere between an autocracy and a meritocracy in our decision making here, right? I think Ben and Beth have a significant amount of sway. I get to have a significant amount of sway in terms of how I think it could be a conservation impact, and so that's sort of how we focus. But then there's also all of that is sort of interwoven with this level of opportunity. What is the opportunity to get to that DNA to use this animal in a meaningful way? And then that's sort of how the cream rises to the top. And sort of what happened to us with direwolf. It was when we launched, we were a mammoth-based company, right? We were only focused on that. And then we suddenly spread to several species. And then direwolf became the obvious choice to be the first to roll out publicly.
I think there are several reasons for that. I mean, it was an obvious choice because we have a gray wolf and we can leverage so much scientific information about gray wolves to make this easier. But also, and we should highlight is that for each of these species, we have community partners who are willing to be involved as stakeholders who ultimately steward these species, right? So we have to have people on the field, on the ground. And it was actually interacting with community partners with our Indigenous Conservation Board, where the idea of the direwolf was first floated. But the science then, the idea that we know so much about gray wolves that we can make these decisions in a way that we know is going to be safe. We have protocols for making sure that the surrogacy can take place in domestic dogs, and they're all going to be safe and healthy. This is all a very if we're going to have this as a technology that's expanding beyond this, that we can really use as a new tool for conservation to stop species from becoming extinct, we have to be able to evaluate how we've done. We have to know if there are any unintended consequences to the animals. We have to be able to learn how they're interacting with the habitats. And there's a very small list of species where we have enough information that we can use as a control to really understand what we've done. And direwolf, gray wolf is a fantastic species pair to get this, I think, foundational data that we need moving forward.
Okay, a couple of questions. One, I know that some people, when the beautiful images of the dire wolves running around were released, said, "Well, that's not really true. They're not really dire wolves." So let me ask you this: so when we had I think they call them spider goats, where they breed goats to be able to produce spider silk, right? So you're doing this synthetic kind of solution. I mean, without confusing all of our lay listeners, is this what's happening in that, the dominant expressive, phenotype looks like a dire wolf for whatever, black magic you've done in the background, but the reality is it's not indistinguishable from the dire wolf that would have existed X years ago, or is it indistinguishable?
I think it probably is distinguishable. We focused on specific phenotypes, right? And we're doing functional de-extinction, right? We're bringing back animals that we think we can slot into a landscape, and they're going to perform some of the ecological roles that those animals once played. It's impossible to make all of the changes right now. Maybe it's never, maybe it's, I mean, probably in the future we'll be able to synthesize whole genomes. We'll be able to bring something back that is identical to the animals that were there. But given existing technologies, we have to work within these constraints, and we still want to be able to generate these animals that can fill these ecological niches. And that's what it means to do functional de-extinction. Taxonomically, whether it's assigned a taxonomic name that's the same as something else, that's for systematists to argue about, and they can. And the spider goats, which are a regular goat but have some DNA that allows them to create the protein to make the spider silk, they have DNA that comes from a different part of the evolutionary tree, and systematists will also fight about how you should actually name them. That's not important to us. I mean, it's important when you have a conversation. The conversation that we are having is about whether these animals can fill the niche of a direwolf, and if they can, then we should call them direwolves.
Very interesting. Actually, I'm looking right now here at a book that I bought about 2 months ago, The Man Who Organized Nature. It's about the original taxonomist, the Swedish Linus,
Yeah,
is that how you pronounce
Carl
it?
Linnaeus,
Linnaeus.
Yeah,
yes.
Linnaeus, thank you. So I haven't read it yet. One of the big stresses in my life is that I've got a gigantic personal library, and every time that I walk into my study and think about all the books that I've yet to read, am I running out of time in terms of my lifespan? God willing, I've got many more years to read the entire library. All right, here's a bit of a technical question. I hope you like it. So I'm an evolutionary behavioral scientist, which basically means I apply principles from evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study human behavior in general, consumer and economic behavior in particular. So one of the things that I learned early in my training with evolutionary psychology is the mismatch hypothesis, right? Which are you familiar with this? You may, even though you're a
No.
evolutionary paleobiologist, you may not know the term. Right? No, that doesn't ring a bell.
No.
So the mismatch hypothesis was originally proposed by people in evolutionary medicine, whereby they argued that many of the diseases that we currently suffer from, actually, I think the top 8 or 9, are due to a mismatch between the ancestral environment where we would have had some adaptations that would have been beneficial then, but in the current environment, they become maladaptive. So, for example, our preference for fatty foods and to gorge on fatty foods would make perfect evolutionary sense in an environment of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty. It doesn't make as much evolutionary sense when I can just go down to the local, fast food place and gorge, and then I'll get colon cancer and diabetes and heart disease and so on and so forth, and high blood pressure. So there's this mismatch that causes many of the ailments that we face today. Can we apply that principle to some of the de-extinction programs that you're doing, whereby whether it be the dire wolf or any other species that you bring back, it occupied an evolutionary niche where it made sense for it to be there. It's mismatched with today. Here ensue the disasters.
It's an interesting question. I when I think about it's similar to an argument that I make about why we need genetic engineering technologies for biodiversity conservation, because I like to point out that habitats around the world are changing faster than evolution can keep up, which places these animals in a situation where they are mismatched with their current environment. And if we can find solutions to that in different parts of the evolutionary tree, if we can, make animals that are better able to resist, plants animals that are better able to resist drought, or that can capture carbon at a different rate, or that have genetic resistance to diseases that have been introduced to their habitats. The black-footed ferret project is a really great example of that, where plague has been introduced into their habitat. They didn't evolve with plague, so they are susceptible to it. But their evolutionary cousins, the domestic ferret, did evolve with plague. They are not susceptible to it. So if we can take that genetic resistance to plague from the domestic ferret and give it using gene engineering to the black-footed ferret, we've created a better match to that habitat for those animals using these tools. So it's really interesting to think about it that way. As far as mismatch to the current environments, one of the reasons that we argue that we probably shouldn't just take wholesale ancient genomes and stick them into an animal today is exactly because of this mismatch with pathogens. If we have a habitat that is not that we have any intention to release dire wolves into the wild where they will interact with gray wolves. We don't intend to do that. But let's say we did, and then we had dire wolves that were more dire wolfy because they had all of the extinct dire wolf DNA. They would not have that evolved susceptibility to whatever diseases are circulating in that gray wolf population, and they would be immediately unfit in that environment of today. So by focusing just on traits that we feel do have the capacity to augment ecosystems by restoring missing links between species and focusing just on those and doing functional de-extinction, we're hoping to avoid this while using these tools to help stabilize these ecosystems and restore missing functionality to make those ecosystems more resilient.
Wow, incredible. This next question is more to Matt, but of course you can weigh in also, Beth. So let me start with a personal story. Back in 2006, I had been invited to the University of New Mexico. They had, I think a lot of the guys have retired since, they had a great evolutionary behavioral sciences group, some anthropologists, some psychologists, some economists. And when I was going there to give a talk on my first book that was about to come out. Now, close to Albuquerque, where the University of Mexico is, there was a wolf sanctuary. I think it's actually called the Wolf Sanctuary, if I'm not mistaken. And I had started communicating with them because it had always been a dream of mine to actually maybe interact with wolves. And once they trusted me and saw that I was kind of a reasonably cool guy, they actually allowed me first to enter an enclave with some puppy wolves. And then later, I asked them, I had the temerity of asking them, there was a male or a female who have since passed away, but you could still go on their website and see them, Raven and Cheyenne. They were full adult wolves. I said, do you think I can go in there? And they said, are you sure you can handle it? Now, I come from a Belgian Shepherd's background, and so maybe I had the chutzpah to think that it wouldn't be too scary. I actually went in there, and then I even convinced my wife to go in there. We have photos of it. It was one of the most mystical experiences I've ever had. They actually started howling right in front of me. So my next question, maybe more to Matt than to you, Beth, am I going to be allowed to interact and play with the dog?
I think we could figure out an arrangement. Obviously, we're not playing and interacting with them. We get close. We do at times need to share space with them. They're in a very large preserve, so they're used to their very small subset of caretakers being around them. If somebody they'd never seen would show up, it's most likely that they would hightail it to the other end of the habitat, and eventually they would habituate and come back.
But right now, there is a not, I don't want to say domesticated, but there is a bond that is developed between a few keepers and the
Yes.
existing direwolves. Okay.
They've been habituated with a small team of caretakers that help manage them every day, help check on their health, feed them. So there's an association with food, comfort, reward for them to be around people. And that's really important in the way that we manage animals under human care, because we need these animals to participate in their health care, right? Just like you and I go to the doctor, they need to go see the doctor on occasion. And the least stressful way to do that is to have a certain level of habituation to a small group of people that they trust, and they'll allow us to do, very basic observations, exams. If there's something more intervention, more significant intervention needed, then that requires anesthesia. But right now, I unfortunately think if you walked in today, their first instinct would be to run to the other side of the
So
habitat.
that's already better than them eating meat. So
Well, now they're only 7 months old today.
right. Okay.
So if we waited till they were 2 years old, and these males had the full time to mature, and they had a territory, and they had the testosterone needed to be bold wolves, they'd most likely come up and make a very clear they clearly communicate that this is my territory and you shouldn't be here.
As I'm hearing you speak, I was thinking about possible projects that one can do at research projects, behaviorally speaking.
Mhm.
I'm a behavioral scientist. So, for example, you probably have seen the studies with wolves where when you compare, the pointing paradigm. So you basically just point to where the food could be. Dogs pass that test very easily because they have sort of co-evolved to take cues from their human partners, whereas wolves do very, very poorly on the pointing task. I mean, for reasons that we can surmise. So I'm wondering, have you guys thought, maybe it's too early in the process, but have you thought eventually of conducting, ethological, zoological, behavioral studies with some of these de-extinctified animals that you're bringing back to life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a long list of questions that we have that people in our network have. And it ranges from everything from what are the genetic epigenetic effects of cloning and gene editing and epigenetic aging to what are the behavioral impacts, what are the what are some of the social ecology questions we could answer. So the short answer is yes, we have, and we're very focused on things that impact health directly today. But we want to begin to expand that as we're sort of getting our legs under us here.
Well, so this is a question for Beth. So you're much of your career, most of your career has been in academia. Now you've taken a sabbatical, you've gone to industry. We often hear, and certainly I've said so, that in academia, regrettably, oftentimes universities is where innovation goes to die because you have to spend 74,000 years going through all of the hoops. For me to run the most innocuous study ever, I have to go through 6 months of institutional review boards and blah, blah, blah. So has that been true as you've segued from academia to your current position where things move much more quickly because you don't have the same sort of bureaucratic oversight over you?
It's we still have bureaucratic oversight. We do not get to operate in a regulatory vacuum. We still have external IACUCs and review boards, and every experiment that we do has to be approved by somebody outside. And then everything that we do is regulated within the existing regulatory frameworks of the country in which we're operating. So, we have oversight by the FDA and the USDA for the animal facilities, and people imagine. I think some of the fears that we've been is like, oh my goodness, like in Jurassic Park, they just got to do whatever the hell they wanted with these things, which is just it's just not true. And it's good that it's not true, right? I mean, we want things to be correct and safe and to operate within this framework, and the framework exists for that purpose. So we're not pushing against it, or we're not outside of the regulatory framework in a way that would make our lives completely easy. But I also am a little bit relieved by that. My scientific reputation is staked on that we're doing this in a transparent way that is accurate and correct within these regulatory frameworks.
I was
That
gonna say,
said, I do not have to go to faculty meeting, which is great.
I was
And
gonna
that certainly takes
I was
give
going
me
to
some
say, I don't
time.
think you have to worry about your scientific reputation having been just inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. I think you can move past that concern. Where are you guys located, or at least more importantly, where are the direwolves located? Are you guys?
Uh,
So our company is based out of Dallas, Texas. The
Oh, Dallas.
wolves are in a secret location that's
Ah,
really, we're only keeping it under a veil of secrecy, mostly for the protection and the safety of those wolves and the people that care for them. Because, even, funny story, even when we announced the woolly mouse a month prior to the direwolf announcement, we had people come into the front door of this office building right here saying, I want to see the woolly mice. I want to see and you go, this is not how this works. This is not a zoo.
no.
This is not exhibition. This is a professional working environment. So we're very sensitive about their location and their safety.
got you.
Right.
I wanted to read for you. This is, I think, the tagline of your company: "The science of genetics, the business of discovery." The reason why it kind of caught my attention because I operate in my academic career at that exact intersection, and that I apply evolutionary psychology while housed in the business school. Right. So I'm trying to, for much of my career, I've been a professor now for 31 years, to Darwinize the business school. The idea being that you can't study entrepreneurship or personnel psychology or organizational behavior or consumer behavior somehow completely detached from the fact that all of these human agents are shaped by an evolutionary set of mechanisms. But yet, most of my social science colleagues think it is the most heretical thing to ever state that, biology and evolutionary biology apply to every species on Earth except one called Homo sapiens. Maybe I'll start by asking this to Beth, and then Matt, of course, you can also weigh in. Are you familiar with this incredible obstacle to try to get scientists to accept that evolutionary principles also apply to this species called Homo sapiens?
Yes, in fact, in my most recent book, which is called Life as We Made It, I talk a bit about this and how I say humans are a new type of evolutionary force. We're shaping absolutely everything around us, and the decisions that we make shape everything around us. And I think a lot of the ethical slash moral questions that people ask us about the work that we're doing try to put humans outside of what we're doing, it's fun to talk about, right? But if you stand back and think about it, it's also a little bit frustrating. Like this idea of how it's too scary to try to do this. We can't do this. What is it? It's not our role to bring species back to life or to help species adapt to the changing climates. Well, why not? Why isn't it our role? I mean, we evolved to have this big brain and the ability to make decisions and to recognize that we might want to stop doing such damage on the rest of the world. We evolved enough to be able to develop the technologies to do this, and we should apply that to being able to make a difference. Standing back and doing nothing is also a decision. It also has consequences, right? And so we should think about these things rather than just wring our hands about how scared we are, right?
So
Yeah, I think
yeah, I'm sorry. Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, I always find it interesting when people have the question around, are you playing God? Because I think there is a real selective focus there, is that they are selecting to focus on this action and ignore the 99% of other actions in which we assert our humanity on nature every single day. But they go, well, this is the one I have questions on. Well, you went to go visit your family and vacation on a jet plane that consumed dino juices to get you there, right? Like there was a lot of activity in there that impacted nature, and you never thought about that as a decision. But that too is a decision every day.
In terms of interdisciplinarity, so one of the other things that has defined my career, some might say it was detrimental for my career. I would argue opposite. In academia, you're supposed to be a hyper specialist, right? A stay in your lane guy. You train in a particular methodology in a particular framework, and then keep pumping out papers plus delta within this thing. Well, life is too short for me to only do that. And so I've published papers in psychology and in marketing and in economics and in medicine and in bibliometrics. I don't care where I publish as long as I have hopefully something interesting to say. So universities always say, yes, yes, interdisciplinarity. But then when you try to implement something that is interdisciplinary, then they all become sort of territorial over their little fiefdoms. And so from this side, I'm interdisciplinary. From that side, I'm not. But I can only imagine that the projects that you guys are doing now at Colossal Biosciences is by nature, by definition, greatly interdisciplinary. So can you maybe talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the first questions that you asked was sort of what are the new technologies that led to this discovery. I've always sort of described Colossal as an intersection of technologies, an intersection of emerging technologies, and we're sort of combining those to create a toolkit that allows this to happen. So I think, I'm always amazed at how many things Beth is involved in terms of the various sciences that she's needing to direct. And then we're weaving that into things like how do you create an animal care strategy and management strategy for a species that's never existed before, hadn't existed in 12,000 years, right? And so we're always trying to weave our different expertise and our sciences together in a really interesting way. And so I like to think of Colossal as this sort of amazing, the world's most interesting intersection.
Wow. You want to add anything, Beth?
Well, I was just going to say this is to your point about how you're publishing in marketing and you're publishing in business and you're publishing in evolutionary psychology. I mean, one of the reasons that I decided to take this leave and join Colossal is because, we only get a certain number of rotations around the star at the center of our universe. And you want to be doing things that are actually impactful. And you want to be doing things that require you to learn something new and interact with people that you've never interacted with before and figure out where you're wrong, right? Because good scientists want to know where they're wrong so that they can figure out how to not be wrong, right? And if you're just operating in that little lens of your own world forever, you're probably hardly ever going to be wrong. And that means you're never going to learn anything and you're probably not going to make a big impact. So I love the fact that we're at the center of everything and that we're doing all sorts of things at the same time and pushing as hard as we can in lots of different directions simultaneously.
Have
And
you
sort of the leg that's missing in this three-legged stool that is Beth and me and is Ben is what Ben's able to bring to this is really interesting for me coming from a nonprofit conservation background to this the way we market, the way we communicate, the way we want to build economics around sustainable conservation initiative is amazing. So it's all the sciences, and then there's the business, the marketing, the comms, all that's layered into, I think, I hope is one of the most interesting companies to have emerged in the last decade or so.
Incredible.
Actually, what we're forgetting though is just that it's also just cool, right? It's freaking cool. And people, and because of the marketing and the comms, we have like kids reaching out to us. My kids came back from school, both of them, and said, in my science class today, they talked about this because it was on the news. My colleagues at Santa Cruz were saying the undergrads were coming in and talking about it in class, feeling inspired that there was something that they could do about the conservation crisis. And as we think about all of the, oh, people scared, I'm scared of this, where's it going to go? Is it too scary? We also have to remember the number of people that, because of the direwolf announcement, thought about extinction and biodiversity loss and ecosystems and genetic engineering for the very first time ever in their whole lives is huge. And if we're gonna have a future that is both filled with people and lots of other biodiverse species, we need people to be more engaged than they naturally would be. And this is a way to do it. And we owe that to this sort of crazy strategy that Ben brings to the table, along with obviously how just cool it is to
Well,
be
I
able to do
mentioned,
this.
yeah, I mentioned earlier that I first learned about you guys through seeing Ben on Joe Rogan, which kind of brings me to a point that I referred to earlier about stay in your lane. When I first went on Joe Rogan, which would have been now many, many years ago, I think I might have been maybe the first professor to ever go on. It was looked with great derision that I come from the lofty ivory tower to speak to the great unwashed. And I tell a story in one of my books how when I had gone to Stanford Business School to give a talk, they were really not into the fact that I was going on Joe Rogan. Whereas now they all write to me and say, "Oh, please, can you introduce me to Joe Rogan?" Because it speaks to the fact that if we are doing really valuable science in any field, you do want people to be inspired by it. I don't want to only speak to 13 people who are going to read my peer-reviewed article. I want millions. So for me, I started this show for no other reason than I thought I had some interesting things that I could say. I thought I could bring some really cool guests on the show. Let's open it up to everybody. And luckily, I've been able to build a pretty big platform. So I love the fact that you guys are doing this. I mean, I always say life is marketing and marketing is life. I mean, animals communicate to one another, advertise their mating, attraction through marketing, right? I mean, sexual signaling is a form of marketing. So I love that you guys are doing this. Maybe you could tell us in the few minutes that we have left, what are some, if you're willing to promote the stuff, what are some downstream projects that you're working on that we're all going to be excited to hear about at some not too distant future, I hope.
Well, we have the three flagship projects, the mammoth, the thylacine, which is also the Tasmanian tiger, and our dodo project. And we'll be announcing another project coming up in a month or so, which I'm not going to say what it is yet, but stay
Ah,
tuned. It'll be exciting to hear about it. And then we have a bunch of conservation projects. Matt, you want to highlight some of the coolest things that are
Yeah,
coming
I
up?
would say if you're really interested in maybe what our next de-extinction project might be, you should also pay attention to Joe Rogan coming up, because I think Beth is going to be making an appearance with Joe to talk about some of those.
ah. Is this your inaugural on Joe
Yes, I've
Rogan?
not done that
Ah,
before.
you're rookie, you.
But on the conservation front, we launched so we have Colossal Biosciences, which is the company we launched. But last November, we also launched the Colossal Foundation. The Colossal Foundation is our 501(c)(3) conservation organization that's focused on applying our technologies that we create from Colossal Biosciences to the conservation world. We give these tools away for free. We want to engage with conservation NGOs. So we're working on things like the American red wolf. How can we help support the key to conservation of the Sea of Cortez, which is the most critically endangered porpoise in the world? How can we use genetic rescue as a tool to save populations of animals like northern white rhino and Mauritian pink pigeon that have gone through these enormous population bottlenecks? And then also, can we use genetic engineering as a tool to confer toxicity resistance to the northern quail, to confer adaptive qualities to other like drought resistance maybe to some other species that are on the brink? So we'll keep pounding these out. As you might imagine, our comms team is constantly working on a cadence of announcements to show and highlight the amazing conservation work we're doing that sort of comes in between our de-extinction announcements.
Very, very exciting. I can't imagine how excited you guys must be to every day walk into those offices. What an adventure. I in one of my last book, I talk about, so it's a book on happiness, and I have an entire chapter on life as a playground. And I argue that science is the ultimate form of playground, right? I mean, it's puzzle making. There's a bunch of variables, and I'd like to see which variable is associated with which other one in a meaningful way. And I guess you guys get to do this from 8 in the morning till 8 at night every day. So maybe one day I'll come and visit you out there and you'll tell me where
Uh,
the direwolves are.
That'd be
that
great.
would be amazing. Yeah. Either you come visit us at the labs or one day I'll take you to the wolves.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Thank you. Hey guys, stay on the line so I could say goodbye
Yeah.
offline. Thank you so much for coming on. Anything I can do to help promote your projects, always reach out. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show.
Thank you, so. This is
Cheers.
great.
Thank you.